Hey, welcome back. Today we are talking about our third linkage institution, interest groups. This is going to cover topics 5.6 and 5.7, interest groups influencing policymaking and groups influencing policy outcomes. In this lesson, you're going to learn what interest groups are, what type of interest groups there are, strategies used by interest groups, and how interest groups influence lawmakers. Let's get started. An interest group is a formal or informal association of people seeking to influence government policy in favor of their interests. Interest groups may represent social causes, economic and corporate interests, or even religious and ideological interests. Interest groups want to influence policy. In order to do that, they want to make sure that money from the national budget is directed in places that they want, and they want to get attention from the public so that the public can then also influence lawmakers in the direction that they want. Why do they want to do this? Well, because they want to impact the national conversation about the things that they care about. Let's talk about the types of interest groups that there are. The first is a single issue group, or an interest group that is devoted to one particular issue rather than a larger category of interests. Some examples of single issue groups include Emily's List, which is a pro-choice group that focuses on getting female candidates elected to office, and the NRA, which opposes gun legislation. The next type of group that we are going to look at are ideological or social movements, and these are groups who form together to create social or political change. Some examples include the NAACP, the National Taxpayers Union, the National Organization for Women, and the Christian Coalition. Our next type of interest group are protest movements. These are groups that bring attention to social problems through public demonstrations or other forms of non-violent direct action. Some examples include the Women's March, Black Lives Matter, and March for Our Lives. Labor unions are organizations of workers who share the same occupation. These are usually concerned about wages or working conditions. Some examples include the National Education Association for Teachers and the AFL-CIO, or the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. This is a lot of workers like steel workers or things like that. Finally, there are trade associations, and these are interest groups that are focused on a particular business or industry. So, for example, you've got the American Medical Association, you've got the American Bar Association for lawyers, and the American Corn Growers Association. Think back to Unit 2. We talked about a term called the Iron Triangle. The Iron Triangle is a relationship between an interest group, a congressional committee, and a bureaucratic agency. And these are long-term relationships. They establish these relationships in order to push legislation that benefits all of them. There are some strategies that interest groups use to influence public policy. The first is informing. When they're doing this, they are presenting information to the public and elected officials about issues that matter to their group. When this is done with government officials in particular, it's called lobbying. And there are actually people whose job it is to lobby on behalf of interest groups. The next is donating, or giving money to political campaigns in exchange for support by the candidate on certain pieces of legislation, or even for them to just have a favorable viewpoint toward their cause. This can get a little bit tricky because interest groups cannot cross the line between donating to a candidate and bribery. And it's a very, very fine line. Next is endorsement, or supporting a candidate for office and suggesting that the group's members vote for him or her. Litigation, this is initiating legal action, most often in civil rights cases. This was the case for Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was actually on that train in order to try to bring legislation about that would reduce segregation. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court went the other way and increased segregation through Plessy. It was also done in DC versus Heller, which struck down the Firearms Control Registration Act in Washington, D.C. Finally, mobilization, or organizing a group of people to take collective action. This can be things like boycotts or protests, or even letter writing campaigns to politicians. Interest groups have some really positive contributions. They raise awareness of public issues, they represent people based on ideas, they inform members and government officials, so they provide an education service, and they encourage political participation. However, there are some negative attributes to interest groups as well. It's difficult to measure their membership. They don't necessarily represent all of their members' views. This is especially true for labor unions. And unfortunately, it has been true in the past that they have sometimes used bribery or threats for influence. So let's talk about how interest groups really do influence lawmakers in particular. Now, influence can be impacted by a couple of things. There are inequality of political and economic resources among interest groups. Some interest groups have more money and therefore more influence than others. And because of that, they have unequal access to decision makers. One of the biggest problems for interest groups themselves, though, is the free rider problem. This is in particular for member groups where you actually have to pay to be a member. This is true for the NRA and labor unions and different things like that, where people outside of the group are actually able to benefit from the work that that group does without having to pay for being a member. So, for example, with the NRA, anyone who is a gun owner and appreciates hunting and recreational gun use is benefiting from the NRA whether they are donating to the NRA or not. A lobbyist is a person who attempts to influence decisions made by officials in government. Lobbyists are often employed by interest groups in order to help them influence lawmakers. There are two main characteristics of lobbyists. The first is the characteristic of being an exchanger. They exchange goods for support, or they will exchange support for that candidate for support for their legislation. They are also educators. They provide valuable expertise to busy legislators who are uncertain of the facts surrounding an issue. A lobbyist will go into a legislator's office and tell them about all of the good things or the bad things about a certain piece of legislation. Another way that interest groups build influence is through coalition building, or this is the banding together of several interest groups for the purpose of lobbying. When they band together, they're able to increase their influence because they are able to increase their money, so they're able to make each of their donations stretch a little bit further than they would have separately. So why would interest groups want to band together? Well, that can happen for a number of different reasons. A big reason that happened in recent years was after the Parkland shooting with gun control. The NRA is one of the best funded interest groups in the country. On the other side, you had March for Our Lives and the ACLU. Well, March for Our Lives was brand new. They were created because of the Parkland shooting from people who survived that shooting. So they partnered with the ACLU in order to increase their influence with their lobbyists and their money. In this lesson, you should have learned what interest groups are, what type of interest groups there are, strategies that interest groups use, and how interest groups influence lawmakers. If there's anything you missed, go back now and re-watch that part of the video. Then, make sure to go in and answer the summarizing question in your notes so that you can receive a stamp the next time we're in class. All right, guys, we'll see you later. Bye.